My name is Doug Morrison. I am a client success manager here at Sentrian. It's going to be a little bit of how we protect our data from overuse with AI tooling, but also just to do with good structuring of data, because it's always good to know where our data lives, especially when we're talking about personally identifiable information, PII, or intellectual property, because we want to make sure that we're posting that in places that are well governed, well structured, and secure locations. We want to map out where our data is. We want to know what it is, first of all, because, like you say, every department's going to hold different data. That's the first step, really, is just running some tooling just to try and identify what information the business holds, where that sits. Then have a round table with the business unit leaders or with the nominated data governance champions, try and identify what legislation is over those types of information. 50% of it is the tooling that's required to launch our controls and govern our data. And the rest of it is engaging with the business because the practice is only as good as the people who enact it. So we want to bring those people on board, those kind of data champions, kind of like a data protection officer, like the nominated person in charge and responsible for the enactment of that data governance strategy. So data governance, I guess, is less concerned with the perimeter boundaries. That's kind of like we should hopefully have tooling already in position to cover for that. This is more along the lines of we want to make sure we can manage and mitigate against the risk of oversharing because we're not just talking about the risk to a data breach. Like a data breach doesn't necessarily mean a bad actor has facilitated unauthorized access to our system. Sometimes it's our own staff who are doing something that they shouldn't have done. Maybe they're sharing a link to a SharePoint or Dropbox folder or file that they shouldn't be doing. Or maybe they're a disgruntled user who are kind of leaving on bad terms. So we want to be able to make sure that we are covered for those circumstances as well. Microsoft 365 really has the tooling embedded into it already. It's determined by the licensing structure that the business holds as to what functionality they can get out of that product. But that has extensions that go beyond the Microsoft ecosphere and touches places like Dropbox and other locations where a business may store data. It's not also limited to the cloud. You can also extend it to your legacy file servers that you might have on premise as well. Microsoft Purview has been around for a number of years. Data governance has been big business probably since GDPR in the EU took out in 2018. So other parts of the world have been dealing with this kind of crisis of managing and mitigating data. It's something that probably we're catching up to now in Australia. We see high profile breaches come up all the time. Businesses are starting to sit up and take notice of responsibilities. Government too, as you mentioned, with that policy update to the Privacy Act that's currently sitting with Parliament, and that's going to have massive implications to how businesses are expected to behave when it comes to the responsibility of managing data. We can limit what an AI tool is able to see and use in its aims and what our objectives are with that. If we're talking about training an AI tool to build some documentation for us or some policies for us, we can limit what it can see and do. We don't want it to be touching information that's super sensitive, for example, so we can limit that through the use of governance tooling. Governance really is concerned with just the scope of the tooling, so we want to just make sure that the scope is correct and accurate and isn't an overreach. But beyond that, from a governance perspective, you kind of manage that within the AI tooling itself, kind of what the construct of that is. We'd be looking at setting up a data governance strategy. So you have your strategy document that outlines what our kind of objectives are, lists out our policies, procedures, and the users who are the kind of nominated champions and protection officers, things like that. Have our list of chain of command. And then we go through our policies and procedures. We need to have those in place as well. And then we look at the tool sets, what we want to implement, the controls, things like that are all kind of, it's like a waterfall. It's all kind of flows down from that governance strategy. And then once that's all in place, then we're ready to go and play with our AI tools. immature data governance approaches and strategies are evident everywhere in every kind of breach that we see. A lot of those could be limited or mitigated completely with a proper strategy in place. And you probably see that a lot more in Europe, where the GDPR kind of is a little bit more mature. Yeah, so without a proper strategy in place, if you were to suffer a breach, or if you had a disgruntled user leaving, like we mentioned earlier, you need to have the procedures in place for how you deal with that situation. So a disaster recovery plan, essentially. And without that sort of procedure in place, then you're really finding yourself scrambling. You don't know the process that you need to be taking, the steps, who you need to notify, for example, and how you lock down further risk to a loss of data. So that would be a prime example of the lack of maturity in procedures and policies that just lead to further risk of data loss. Reputational and risk, I mean, especially for small to medium sized businesses, the risk is much larger in terms of bounce back, and how you go forward from that incident is very difficult to maintain. It all starts with a mature approach to a strategy. Get the people on board. We need to have buy-in across the business. It's not just an IT problem. It's a business problem that needs to be looked at with maturity and responsiveness. The whole business needs to kind of champion the adoption of this, and then you look at the tools, how we use those to our advantage. So Sentrian, we have data governance offerings that we can look at to help organizations as they progress through that maturity journey. Because it is a journey. You start off, as I say, with that workshop and understand what the problems are, where the concerns are, what the data looks like, and where it sits. So Sentrian can help with that. We can help you map that out for yourselves with the policies, the procedures, the controls, right through to the implementation and ongoing support as well. Because it is something that needs to be maintained. We touched on that earlier with just that we set up the configurations in that, but then kind of ongoing things change. Monitoring needs to be in place. We need to make sure that we are monitoring any loss that may be in progress at that time. Never static. Yeah, the business needs, business requirements change, but also the tooling changes. It matures. Our ability to mitigate risk increases, changes over time. Especially when we look at AI coming in. And AI is not just there to augment how we manage our data, but also how we protect it too. So it's there for from a security perspective as well.